Hi, welcome to the A-Team Group's webinar. Today, we're covering an update on data standards and global identifiers. So my name is Dessa Glasser. I'm the chair of the Global LEI Foundation, which issues the Global LEI, which has been adopted by regulators. I'm also on the board of Oppenheimer and Company and responsible for data and analytics at FRG. But what I'd like to do is we have an esteemed group of speakers. So we have Merlin Dowse, Executive Director, Trade and Working Capital at JP Morgan and Vice Chair of the ICC Banking Corp. And we have Emma Kalamaki, which is Managing Director at ANA and the Derivative Service Bureau. We have Laura Stanley, who's a Director of Symbology at LSEG. And we have Ari Marcus, who is Managing Director for Institutional Client Group Operations and Technology at Citigroup. So we have a very good panel. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a moment. But first, what I'd like you to do is just look at how you can participate in today's webinar. So to the right of the video, you're going to see a box for questions and for polls. We'll be polling the audience during this, and I'll be asking the webinar, and I'll be asking the speakers to comment on some of the results. So I'll remind you when the polls are live. But if you go to Slido, just look there for DMI webinars, and you'll see that. And if you'd like to ask any questions, just put them in there. I'll be looking at it as well during the process. But we have a number of questions. Enough about me and background. Let's ask our speakers to introduce themselves. So Merlin, let's start with you.
Hi, Dessa. Hi, all. Pleasure to be here with you today. Merlin Dowse, Product Manager within the Trade and Working Capital space, as Dessa had mentioned. But I think what's more relevant for today's conversation is the role that I play on the International Chamber of Commerce's Digital Standards Initiative, where I'm a member of the Industry Advisory Board, and looking forward to today's session. Thank you.
Thanks. Emma, how about yourself?
Hi, my name's Emma Kalamaki, as you mentioned. I work for both ANA, which is the Association of National Numbering Agencies, and the Derivative Service Bureau, which is the numbering agency responsible for assigning ISINs for OTC derivatives. Now, the DSB, also following its designation by the Financial Stability Board, is responsible for launching the UPI service, which we did this week, to enable authorities to aggregate OTC derivative data reported to trade repositories. So that's a key element related to standards. And I've been working in the space of standards for almost 20 years, really.
Oh, fantastic. And congratulations on the launch.
Thank you.
Laura, yourself and your interest in the
Hi there, I'm Laura Stanley. I'm the Director of Symbology within LSEG, and I work in the Data and Analytics division. I'm responsible for a number of identifiers within the symbology space under LSEG. That includes CDOL, ISIN, LEI, PermID, both from a business and strategic standpoint. And also London Stock Exchange is a member of ANA, and I have a seat on the board of ANA and the DSB.
Great. And Ari, how about yourself and your interest in standards?
Yes, Ari Marcus. I'm a Managing Director within the business that has been rebranded recently as Services, Markets and Banking at Citi. I am the Data Governance Officer for that area, where I engage our lines of business in order to ensure that we are driving commercial as well as regulatory objectives through standards adoption. And my involvement in the space, I've previously the head of reference data operations at Citi for the same business, and also Citi, I'm currently Citi's representative to the EDM Council and serve on the board there. And previously I was chair of the advisory board for the CUSIP Service Bureau.
So we have very good background coming from, for our panel, coming from different areas. So let's set the scene first. How do you see the state of play on data standards and global identifiers? Laura, can we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think where we are today, if we look back at where we were in 2017 with the introduction of MiFID II, EMIR, and where identifiers are mandated, we've seen a steady rise in the adoption of global identifiers used for regulatory reporting, but also for monitoring market abuse, which is really essential. Data standards such as the LEI and the ISIN code have been really key in supporting the regulation. And we at LSEG are an NNA, the National Numbering Agency for UK ISINs, and we're also an LOU, a local operating unit, for issuing LEI codes. So we really work to support the market as well as promoting adoption. Now, in our role in supporting data standards, we do this alongside standing up our proprietary identifiers, such as the CDOL, the PERM ID, and that's something that we look to continue to do and hopefully operate effectively in the future. So I think firms have become increasingly clued up in understanding reporting requirements, definitely a lot more than where we were in 2017. And they've seen the added benefits that data standards bring along to that, especially when it comes to identifiers. We know that regulatory reporting drives the adoption, and we've really seen this in the cases of ISIN and the LEI. You know, they are working to help make the financial sector more efficient, but there is still more work to do.
Great, thank you. Emma, how about yourself? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I think just to add to what Laura said, I agree, with regards to the current state that we're seeing with standard adoption. And really, I think standards have become common nature within the financial services sector now, and are embedded within the different workflows and are driven very much, as Laura said, by regulatory requirements. I think there's some very well-established standards. So when Laura mentioned the ISIN, we're talking about over 40 years. The ISIN standard has been used, and it was really one of the foundations of interoperability and cross-border trading. So you can see how far we've come through the launch of standards. And then you have newer standards that are being implemented still, but also the key element being that evolution piece. So I think the standards process isn't one where the standards are just implemented. So we do see, as part of the implementation and adoption, that you have to nurture the standards. It's an ongoing process as well.
Okay, great. And Merlin, anything to add from the trade finance world or your work on the ICC?
So I think this is maybe trade is the new kid on the block, right? So if for those in the audience, it may be worthwhile just understanding where trade fits in. So trade finance is actually a form of payment within the banking sector, and it pertains to the purchase and sale of goods or services, be it domestic or cross-border. Now, for trade, as I said, the train has just left the station in terms of standards adoptions, right? And this was thanks to the ICC's Digital Standards Initiative, which launched back in 2021, which sought to identify and leverage existing standards, which are out there today, maybe identify potential gaps to promote the digitization of trade. Trade finance is very archaic. It's very paper intensive business, high cost base, and it's through the promotion and advocacy of standards that we look to streamline and digitize the trade industry. But as I said, early days, and that's what we're here to do.
And that's very welcome. And that's a big focus also of GLIFE. We've focused on that a lot. And I can tell you from previous life where I worked in a trade industry. So it needs to be digitized. So that's fantastic. All right, we're going to launch a poll question right now. So thank you for that. And I'm going to go right into another question. So if you can please log your responses on the poll. I'll ask for comments on that in a bit, but let's get to our next question, which is, are standards and identifiers meeting the objectives of reducing risk, improving transparency, and easing compliance? And if not, why not? And what kind of changes are needed? So I'm going to go back to Emma, and then I'll go to Ari.
Sure. Well, I would say that as we mentioned in answering the first question, that a lot of the driver is coming from authorities, from the regulators, and their primary concern is having greater transparency, being able to monitor market abuse, look at systemic risk. So definitely, as far as the authorities go, I think we see the trend is that, yes, standards are assisting in bringing efficiencies, bringing data alignment, harmonization, allowing there to be consistency in reporting, and the benefits are being driven. I would say maybe where we're not seeing as much traction is the voluntary use case for firms actually using the standards for their own purposes and not just as a tick box, yes, I'm fulfilling a regulatory requirement. And I think really trying for firms to understand what the purposes and the roles of the standards are, whether they're identifiers that can be used to understand your counterparties. And we know with LEI, AML, KYC versus ISINs and product identifiers like the newly launched UPI, understanding your exposures to particular issuances and issuers, etc. So there are a lot of capability beyond just needing to report it to bring transparency to the authorities. And I think really understanding and leveraging your internal workflows and needs to understand the business processes and how you can apply those standards to bring further benefits to your business, and looking at your data management in general, I think is a way in which to do that. But I definitely, and I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that I'm an advocate for standards, but I do also think that you have to have the relevant governance and evolution around standards. They can't just be static or stagnant. They need to evolve as the markets evolve.
And they need to be put into your own processes, et cetera, not just regulatory. Okay, Ari, how do you feel about that? Are we meeting the objectives of reducing risk? Like, where are we in that process? And
I think that the area where the standards since the financial crisis have made the most significant strides and progress really is around compliance, because a lot of them were born out of regulatory necessity. And where the regulations exist, I definitely think that the use of standards has brought much more transparency into those areas of the markets, whether it's around transaction reporting or market abuse or other use cases. Now we're starting to see it in the payment space, that there definitely is a benefit around transparency and risk reduction for those specific areas where there are regulatory or industry mandates. And I think that really to make better use of standards, it really comes down to driving adoption and making sure that there's more reasons across more products, like Merlin was alluding to, the trade finance space, where there's needs for standards, and making sure that the standards that are developed are really fit for purpose, that they're solving that problem. I think that that's another key in addition to the need to drive adoption.
Agreed. Thank you. So let's go to some of the poll results, if we can show this. Okay, to a good extent. That's nice to hear. How about Emma? Do you want to comment on that? Does this surprise you, or is this?
No, I'm very pleased to see the result, because I think it is a good indicator of the level of integration that we're seeing, that we would hope to see with standards. And if they are bringing, reducing risk and increasing transparency within the organization, then that is, serving the purpose, and they're being used beyond just the regulatory purpose there. I'll interpret it as meaning that as well. So I think it's really positive to see. It shows there's still some work to be done, because not everyone is in the same position as yet, but I think that's also expected with firms of different sizes and different responsibilities, reporting obligations. There are bound to be varying degrees of integration, but I think this is a really good indicator.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, and thanks to the audience. for participating. Let's turn to the regulatory requirements. What are the regulatory requirements for data and standards and identifiers? So I'm going to go to and talk to Anna and LSG. So Laura, how about you? Do you want to comment on that?
Yep, sure. So I'll speak to this question in the concepts of regulations that require identifiers. That's MiFID II, EMIR, MiFIR, UK MiFIR. They require both ISIN and LEI in different cases for transaction reporting obligations. And the firms aren't able to execute a trade on behalf of a client if they don't have an LEI. So there's just like one example where it's absolutely key. Standards that are already adopted and commonly used to facilitate the adoption of future regulatory requirements, they're being introduced because of the core mechanisms that enable data points, they're already in place. So if we take FRTB as an example, that's coming into place in 2025. And ISIN and LEI will actually play a key role for credit instruments due to the unique identification and information at the entity level and the security level. So that's something that's coming up in the future, and at LSEG we are supporting that in terms of FRTB, and we're working closely with clients to offer solutions there, and we understand the importance that identifiers play in this space.
Okay, great. Thank you. Emma, how about, can you comment on that, the regulatory requirements?
Yeah, from both the DSB and the ANA view, we are involved a lot in understanding or trying to understand what's needed as far as the regulatory requirements are driving the use of the standards. And where Laura touched on the use cases of ISIN and LEI, I think it's really important to just mention that complementary nature. So yes, standards are there as standalone and have a specific purpose, but actually often they complement each other. We have entity identification complemented with security identification. We have within the security identification, then it's complemented with classification, with the CFI standard, with descriptors, with the financial instrument short name standard. And so within regulations, being able to piece that information together is really useful to use them in a complementary nature. But also on the regulatory reporting side, moving a little bit outside of the EU and the UK, the unique product identifier, which has now been introduced, as I've mentioned now already a couple of times, as it is like a proud parent having a child this week, launching the UPI service. We're seeing, more data alignment, harmonization and consistency across the G20 jurisdictions. We have the US implementing the UPI in January, followed by the EU in April, in the end of September, the UK in October, Australia and Singapore, and recently Japan said in April 2025. So there you see an identifier that is actually being introduced to allow authorities to aggregate data sent to trade repositories on a global basis. We're looking at systemic risk. It's key, and it's playing a role in many different jurisdictions in those reporting frameworks. So it's great to see that they're being leveraged, but there's a level of harmonization and data alignment that can help both firms in being compliant, but authorities in working together for the greater good.
Okay, great. Thanks. And we see that as well. We actually see the LEI as a connector of different identifiers. So I'm glad you brought that up because, they do complement each other as well. And we're seeing more and more go into payments and being recommended. So let me talk to the financial institutions now. So to what extent are the financial institutions and other market participants using standards and identifiers on a voluntary basis? So Merlin, can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I think as I alluded to earlier, right, from a trade perspective, the train's just left the station. So it is very much on a voluntary basis. So on the one hand, as a financial institution, we have to ensure that we adhere to the rules and regulations set forth by the regulators in the jurisdictions that we operate. So one, new one, which is only recent, is Reserve Bank of India in India is asking for the LEI to be part of any payment that's being made. the Bank of England is slowly looking to adopt something similar as part of CHAPS. Now, this has an impact onto trade. So we need to either ask our clients to obtain an LEI if they have it, but then the regulators are asking trade finance banks to even go further and do more in the due diligence of each individual transaction. And this is where standards or identifiers are immensely valuable. So it's about not only the due diligence on the parties involved, which the LEI could clearly enable, but also the goods that are actually being bought or sold. So we do leverage HS codes, right? So, and this is an optional field for clients to present to us to support the verification and validation of the goods that are being transported. But these goods usually end up on a vessel. And we're now also being asked to verify who owns the vessel, where is the vessel, right? So we use yet another standard, which is the IMO number for the vessel, which allows us to verify ownership and location through GPS services. Because when you're financing a transaction of 500,000 barrels of crude oil, you want to know where this is at any point in time. So again, key, it helps, from I like the response to the poll because it does mitigate risk, especially when we're looking at anti-money laundering and sanction screening, which, that's what we need to do before we can proceed with any transaction. So.
Yeah. So you need to know where the ships are but you also need to know where they're domiciled, right? Because sanctions.
Who owns it?
Yeah.
Who owns it, and so forth. So we got to dig deeper, and it's only through the availability of standards, which we need to obtain from the clients that are party to that transaction. So we need everyone to help and push.
Okay. And Ari, comments on that, to what extent the standards are being adopted on a voluntary basis?
It's a slightly different way to answer. So one is that we use the standards to help us improve our operations. So one of the big things that we have being a large global financial institution is just managing the quality of our own client information. So one of the things that we've been able to benefit from the LEI is that we do take in the available API access to information from the GLIFE. We bring that information and we compare it to our own records, and we look for anomalies, and we use it to help with dedupes, cleaning up addresses, legal entity structures, using the attribution that we can get from the LEI record. And then the other part of my response is sort of like, Amazon is a marketplace, but then they have Amazon Web Services. So Citi is one of the few entities that's also a registration agent for our client, which helps our business model, because with the regulations that mandate the use of an LEI, if you're a client and you go to an institution that doesn't have this type of service and you need to secure your own LEI through a service bureau that may not know you, you have to go through a due diligence process, which takes some time. But if we have existing clients that want to sign up like new funds in order to trade act to get an LEI, and they're already existing clients, we're able to give them same day service. So through the use of becoming a registration agent, we have the ability to serve our clients better than if we weren't a registration agent. So it's a interesting way how it's a service that we took on voluntarily to be able to better serve our clients so that they can transact and meet their objectives, and so Citi can become a better partner.
Okay, great. And JP Morgan is the registration, and we're seeing that more and more on the GLIFE, and we're seeing more and more banks signing up to become registration agents. And just for people that don't understand that, banks can get the LEI on behalf of their client, and they will do that as a service for their client and use that internally too. So thank you for that, Ari. Laura, anything to add on that?
Yeah, so I think beyond the compliance aspect, I think participants are really seeing the benefits that they offer. If we take, I know we've talked about the LEI, but it's used to aggregate entity data. We can get the ultimate and direct parent, and it's used outside of regulatory offerings, as Merlin touched on earlier as well. The challenges that come with that are that the way I look at it is it's a circle, and standards are required to support the requirements, and therefore adopted further. But if standards are only required in certain jurisdictions, then increasing adoption can be challenging, because if everyone is not showing the data or displaying it, it's then hard for everyone to be sharing that same version. And then looking at, Emma touched on not touched on, but talked a lot about the UPI and harmonization. ISIN is the primary identifier for underlying instruments, and that's showcases there of the harmonization between the identifiers, and also allowing firms within their existing workflows to integrate a new identifier. And then if we look at like the alternate underlier IDs, I know ISIN is the main identifier to use, but firms are allowed to, if they want to use an alternate ID, such as like CDOL or other identifiers that there are out there. But it's a really useful way to help firms in their existing workflows to actually use a new identifier, especially when it's been mandated. So I think that interoperability is really important.
Absolutely. So just quickly, we can just say is, do capital markets need more standards or more adoption, or both? Emma, do you want to just take that?
Yeah, I think, well, we've touched on adoption, and I'll just go back to that one in the first instance. I think, and Laura, so Ari had mentioned it and Laura had touched on it, and I think adoption and critical mass is really, is the key to the broadest, gives us the broadest possible outcome. The more people that are using a standard, that mutualization, the benefits we get from being able to have it sender and receiver verification, it's becomes the common language, and we are seeing it more and more with, I think, LEI. As I said, ISIN, it doesn't get spoken about as much anymore. It's just kind of fundamental in underpinning. It just happens. You don't hear anything about it because it's fulfilling the role as part of that kind of trade life cycle. I think there are standards that then can go beyond the financial services sector, and we talk about LEI, even trade finance. Well, still we're talking about payments aspects there, but actually entity identification is part of everything that we do. So it can go, the potential is enormous. And I think that that adoption piece, and it ties back into the voluntary use case, because you need buy-in, you need and it comes down to budgets a lot as well. I think, when firms have to consider what they can spend their budget on, unless you've got a real strategic plan around how you're going to use data, it's not always easy to get the money to do the integration that would allow for other use cases, or even the analysis of those other use cases. So I think that's important. But then as to whether we need more standards, I think it is really dependent and driven by the different needs. So we are seeing there is a new standard, the digital token identifier, for example, again, very complementary to the use of ISIN. ISIN we see as much as the traditional asset level identifier, but the digital token identifier, also an ISO standard, is identifying the token at the ledger level. So it gives more data at a technical level to complement what's there with the ISIN. So it's kind of that the ISIN is the bridge then between the traditional assets and the new world, or the new emerging assets. And that allows firms still to undertake all of their existing reporting, exposure, understanding that or compliance that they need to do today. So I think, is there room for more standards? Well, very much depends on the use case and the need. We don't just want standards for the sake of it. There is a cost related to the implementation and adoption. So that always has to be a factor. And I think that where we've touched on already about remaining fit for purpose and ensuring that the standards are evolving in line with the expectations and the use case is really important. And as part of that, having that collaborative effort. And we've seen that far more after the financial crisis, that public-private collaboration to ensure the standards that we're implementing are fit for purpose. And then we've touched on needing then the governance and the processes and controls around those standards to make sure that they continue to be fit for purpose. So I think it's on a case-by-case basis. Do we need more standards? Adoption is definitely something we all need to focus on, the voluntary and the kind of regulatory use cases. But the maintenance and ensuring that the standards remain fit for purpose is fundamental to their success and the longevity and the use, the benefits of their use as we go forward.
Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do, there's a question that came in, and I think that would be good for Emma, you to answer that. Is you talk about the UPI. Can you confirm when firms in the UK will need to have one of them?
Yes, sure. So for the UK, when we're talking about, when we say firms for the UK, it really is depending about where you're trading and where you need to provide your transaction reports. So in the EU, it's going to be the end of April that firms will have to report for their EU reporting obligations, and for UK reporting obligations. These are both under EMEA, I should say. So EMEA in the EU, and then the UK EMEA will be the end of September 2024. So there is still some lead time. As I mentioned, we're live in production. We also have our UAT environment available, and it's the perfect opportunity for firms to use the test environment to understand their workflows, the connectivity that they may wish to use, their integration requirements, how they will manage the data. And they've got a brilliant lead time, especially before the UK now. You've got 10 months or so before the reporting requirements come in, that you can better understand and integrate the data already into your workflows and systems to understand the use case.
Okay, thank you. So let's launch another poll question. So the EU is coming up pretty quickly, and the UK is going to be in September. So this is, what are the challenges in implementing data standards and global identifiers at your organization? You can pick multiple different questions. So while we do that, I'm going to ask the question, Laura, I'm going to ask you, what are the challenges of implementing data standards and global identifiers? Are there any particularly that are hard to implement? And then how can they be resolved?
Yeah, I think education is a big thing here. Not everyone is necessarily, unless they're deep into the regulatory compliance aspect of it, they're not really aware of the importance of standards. And I think that can play a big part. Alongside that is data management. Data management is critical to the standards as well, and the identifiers, and they really go hand in hand. So customers rely heavily on global adoption to enable interoperability. Alongside this, if standards are implemented, then also we have like proprietary IDs. They can further enable interoperability, and because they become embedded into workflows in the future to create more seamless operational efficiencies. So high quality, well-validated data is really important for the industry, and I think the growth of that, you'll then see the greater they are implemented in the future.
Thanks. Merlin, can you comment on that also? The challenges, and are there any ones that are particularly difficult, and how do you resolve that?
Yeah, I think also, and there was also a question on the Slido about someone who's interested in where to obtain standards. So depending on where your organization, what's your purpose, and so from a trade perspective, the ICC DSI has a website, and they published the standards toolkit. So there is reference material that is out there publicly available to anyone looking for existing standards, especially in the trade finance and physical supply chain space. And one of the challenges that the ICC has discovered is harmonization. There are a large number of global standards, there are regional standards, as well as national standards. And when we're looking to digitize and make the trade more interoperable, how do we harmonize these different standards to achieve the ultimate goal? And there's been recent publications. So the Bank for International Settlements, there's a committee on payments and market infrastructures, just released a publication for the G20 addressing the harmonization of ISO 20022 data requirements. This is to support cross-border payments. And this is tackling the fears, right, of inconsistent application of messaging standards in various jurisdictions. So then again, this is worthwhile reading up on. And actually today, it was Stefan Wolf, notified parties of the Wolfsburg Group publishing the payment transparency standards, which again is another publication looking to address the harmonization and promotion of standards. But I think back to Laura's point on education, I think this is key. Education, both internally within our own organizations, externally, and by external, I mean our clients that we serve, corporate clients, right? What's the value of data standards in their shop, right? What value would the LEI bring to them, right? So it's good that the LEI is a bank mandated regulatory data standard identifier, but how can the corporate leverage LEI when they are required to do their own due diligence on their counterparties, right? And the parties that they work with, because they have to do their own level of KYC as well to support. So I think that's it. It's advocacy, education, but also harmonization, I think, is a big challenge from my perspective.
And Ari, I think you've commented on that you've seen that also in onboarding. Do you see that, educating the clients, has that been part of the process on the LEI and why you're getting one? Does that help?
Yeah, I definitely working with clients, helping them understand it. I think that the regulatory mandates, definitely prompted the client base to learn about them so that they could continue with their business activities. But I think a lot of it is just really being able to put yourself in the shoes of different types of consumers and understanding how they can benefit from standards. Because I think that really, like, the world is becoming much more digitized, and in order for us to live in a digitized world, we have to have a way of a common way of looking at information. That's why standards are so key. So if you want to be able to move quickly, if you want to be able to do analytics, the more standards that you have integrated with your data set, the easier it is for you to do that work and to actually get meaningful insights out of it.
Fantastic, thanks. So maybe we can show the poll results. So this should not surprise anyone, because I think, Laura, you want to comment it? It looks like, it's education, and coming up with the use cases, which you've all mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Merlin touched on earlier, it's educating internally and externally. Like there's a lot that I have to do internally to explain to people what identifiers are, what symbology is, because I think there is still, unless you're close to it, either in the regulatory space or the compliance space, it's just an identifier. What do I need that for? It's not interesting. But actually, the more you learn about it, there's so much involved with the data around it, and it is that data intelligence, the data management, but you need the identifier to start with to bring you all of the other aspects as well. So yeah, education is key.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so what I'd like to do is launch another poll right now, and then we're going to talk about to what extent of the business and operational benefits does your organization gain now or expecting to gain from implementing standards. So we're going to go live with the poll, and we're going to start talking about this. So Ari, what are the benefits and business and operational benefits, which I think you've touched on before, and you've talked about a little bit, of a successful implementation of data standards and global ID? What kind of benefits have you seen from doing this? And you mentioned your registration agent.
Yeah, I think there's several. So one of them is just like the minimum is just regulatory compliance and being able to continue with a given product or service that you offer. Another one definitely is the client service benefit, as I mentioned, around being a registration agent is helpful, but a lot of it is also just helping to promote efficiency and STP through reuse of information. And it's good to see that like standards, as you were saying, they complement each other. So, like having the LEI being used for transaction reporting, but also the extension of it into like risk compliance. And also given the fact that the LEI has taxonomy information, also being able to apply it to things like relationship management as well. And then as we're now seeing the LEI going into the payments standard space, that will help as well, because it's sort of like, it's about like the education point. Our markets businesses, our private bank businesses in the market space, like we work with them a lot, but now working with our treasury and transaction services business and educating them and getting them more involved in the LEI. And then the more client base, the more participants that use LEIs for different purposes, the greater adoption that we have, which again, once the standards is in the information, it makes it a lot easier to connect the dots, to use that information to get real insights out of it. And then I think another benefit is just by having a data set with the standards in it, like also helps to reduce our operational risk that we have, and we're doing things without certainty because there aren't standards. Like that risk gets diminished when we have like a trusted digitized data set.
Great, thank you. And the poll's still out there, so we're going to continue commenting, but it is multiple choice, so you can pick more than one answer. So Emma, how about yourself? What do you see?
Yeah, so I agree wholeheartedly with everything that Ari mentioned, and I think that ultimately what we're talking about, one of the key aspects we're talking about is data quality and trust in the data. And I think that standards, having something that is, a common, unambiguous way of defining something, and we're all using the same, it's taking away the need for there being multiple interpretations of the same thing. And that in itself leads to there being improved data quality. We're able to have greater trust in the data. And then when it comes to applying, there's the buzzwords of the moment and the tools to talking about AI and machine learning and the analytics you can drive from that. But really the cornerstone of that being of any use is good data quality and having trust in your data, knowing where your data has come from, and understanding that, and knowing the analysis that comes out of it then can also be relied upon. So I can only agree with everything Ari said and say the fundamentals around data quality for me drive so many other downstream outputs, including regulatory reporting from the business, that they're critical in that space, and that is why we've seen an increased use in them over time.
Great. And Laura, from your standpoint, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has been said already. I mean, from an LSEG standpoint, we cater for a number of these identifiers. If you're coming to list on our markets, we will we issue the ISIN code. If it's a UK incorporated company, we can issue you with an LEI. So we can really help, and that helps throughout the life cycle as well. I think Emma touched on it already, but it's that we all are showing the same version of the truth. So an LEI is only valuable if every counterparty, every market participant is showing the same LEI, and the same for the ISIN and any other identifier. It's really important that everyone is showing the same version so that the flow can be seamless.
Okay, thank you. Totally agree. Or at least the connection between identifiers. I could tell you that when I was a CDO, I maintained 16 mapping up 16 identifiers. So we're going to get to another question from the audience, but let's show the poll results. Ari, does this surprise you? Or it looks like a lot of people are seeing the business benefits. So maybe we'll see some more use. Any
No,
thoughts on this?
I think it's good to see. It's good to see that that the audience realizes the benefits beyond regulatory compliance and this being a mandate, because it really does help us to stitch together our data and make better use of it to a great extent.
Great. Now, Merlin, how about from your end? At trade finance, what are the operational and the business benefits from trade finance? You've talked about some of them, but like specifically.
I think some of these have already been touched on. So as Ari mentioned, whether it's client data, setting up clients onboarding, and administrative processes can become a lot more efficient, even down to transaction processing, as I mentioned. But I think another thing is was addressed earlier on risk mitigation. So mitigating fraud, right? With the LEI, I can verify who parties are. It may be worth noting trade transactions can have up to 10, 15 parties involved in one single transaction. And not all of these are necessarily clients or entities that I know, but I would like to know a little more about these people. And if they would have an LEI, then that would enable me to, dig just a little bit deeper and let me sleep a little better at night and so forth. As I mentioned before, goods description, dual purpose goods, there's concerns around, what's the composition of the goods that are being financed. Then I think the other one is we've seen more and more, either is it fintechs, third-party data providers coming into play in the trade space. So it's that interoperability between our systems and these third-party data providers, whether it's from a credit risk assessment or the latest hot one is ESG, right? We would like to bring in some form of, they're not standards yet. There are no ESG standards yet, and that these are still to come. But can we bring in these ESG ratings into the trade space to help, drive some of the client asks around the use of ESG? And I think the last one is identity. LEI is a great starting place to identify, the legal entity. And as I've mentioned at various other live sessions, my mother's in the Netherlands, right? She has a digital identity already. So why is that? She's not working anymore, but would she work for an organization? Why doesn't that identity get linked to the LEI? So I don't need a wetting signature anymore. I don't need to adopt electronic signatures anymore, but I can combine the LEI with a digital identity to verify who this person is and whether they have the authority or capacity to sign or encumber any organization. So, and these are how we would like to leverage these standards in the trade space.
And I can tell you, and this goes to, thank you. This goes to one of the questions, how important has anti-money laundering enforcement, like FATF sanctions on our country level sanctions on a list of entities been for LEI adoption? It's been very important for us. And the verifiable LEI, the VLEI, the digital identifier, that's been used more and more. We're seeing more and more applications for registration agents within the financial, but outside of the financial markets, because to some extent, if the trade finance and if the clients of the banks are adopting something, the banks will spend more and more time on it. And it's also very good to link to IDs, individuals also to companies. So anything else, on that, how important it's been for LEI adoption? I think it's been extremely important and more are using it. Okay, this is all good, but will there ever be a time when there's too many standards? Does anyone want to take that one?
I'll take it. I think that it's that if there's a need and the standard is fit for purpose, those are enablers for success. If someone comes up with a standard and it really isn't fit for purpose, my expectation is that it will fall by the wayside and it will just it just won't be used. So I think there's sort of a self-monitoring. There's also a significant startup cost of introducing a standard. So I think that that's sort of also challenges the need for just creating standards. So like the high startup costs and the fact that there needs to be a need and it needs to be fit for purpose. Like there's several key hurdles to get over to have something that really is a useful standard.
Yeah, and I would agree totally. And it touches on what I think with the previous, there was an earlier question as in, do we need more standards? I think the same principles apply. You really need to understand what is the role, what is it you're trying to fulfill? What is the purpose of this standard? And it's important, we've been talking a lot about identifiers and data standards in that sense, but there is also standards for a lot of other purposes when we're talking about messaging. So in regulatory reporting, messaging is becoming key. But then we also have within the OTC derivative space the critical data elements. So for the OTC derivative markets, we've had the LEI introduced for entity identification, the UPI introduced for unique product identification, the UTI introduced for unique transaction identification. So that's a lower level of granularity with more economic terms. And then you have these critical data elements. And so it's a set of data terms essentially, and that the authorities and market participants have been working on in order to understand how things should be, a standardized way of dealing with things that don't fall within the scope of the identifier standards themselves. So I think it's important to understand different standards for different purposes and different functions across the ecosystem. And you're right that investment is required, whether it is to implement a standard is one set of cost, but that whole integration through the whole life cycle. And Dessa, you touched on there already being a number of identifiers, that's it, or data elements, that's it. And what do firms generally do? Based on my past experience, firms don't want to lose any data that they already have. So it becomes another point that has to be cross-referenced and mapped. And so you really want to introduce standards to bring efficiencies and benefits. And so they have to have a purpose there.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to wrap up. We did get one question, and I just would like to, if firms are interested in data standards on a more voluntary basis, there are organizations that give guidance. I know the Global LEI Foundation has a whole marketing team. We give information on LEI, how to adopt it, how to become a registration agent. So I'd encourage you to go there. I think Marlon, you mentioned the ICC has put out a lot of information in this area, the Wolfsburg Group, et cetera. Any other suggestions before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would suggest if you're involved in your local standards body, so each country has a national standards body that you can tap into, but also your peer groups. So any forums from different trade associations, I think you always get useful information from your peers as to how they're using standards as well. So those are good forums to hear more about the use cases.
Yeah, and ISO publishers, there's a fair amount. Most of the consulting firms really can help you in that area as well. So thank you. So let me wrap up quickly. I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to give 3 pieces of advice. This is a rapid fire session here for practitioners working with and implementing data standards and global IDs. Let's start with Merlin.
Champion. Be a champion. As Ari said, everyone's on a digital transformation journey, so be that champion. Research existing standards and leverage existing ones before requesting new ones. And the other one is support the change existing archaic processes benefiting from the use of standards.
Okay, Laura. Thank you. Laura?
So I would say to look at the value beyond the regulatory requirements. We see a rise in firms becoming more agile, an increase in technology. So it's important that we really recognise the value that standards do in this space, and they can carry through to the digital space as well. Secondly, data management is a key challenge within firms today. So access to high quality, well-validated data enables interoperability. So that covers across proprietary IDs and identifier standards as well. So is this essential at incorporating data sets going forward? And then lastly, the digital space. I think that's only going to get huge as we evolve, and existing standards have a role in the future development. The sweet spot will be, it's a word we've heard a lot, but it will be the harmonization of that between the old or the current and the new, and how that works will be paramount to the future success.
Okay. Ari?
Okay, so I guess 3 things. The first is that strategically, it's a good field to be in because the digitization really relies on standards to be successful. So if you're on this call and you're interested, I think it's a good field to be in. There'll be plenty of opportunity. Second, like adoption is the key for creating value. It's very important as someone who's a proponent of standards to take the time to understand like different constituents that you work with and their needs and how the standards will help them be more successful in their work. And then the last is that the work is really hard. It's really hard. But it's also very rewarding. So be tenacious and be persevering. Just a very quick story is that one of the efforts that I was on in my career was taking our internal client standard and rolling it out through like 80 different global of our payments platforms that we have at Citi. And we did it for, we need this ID for, for risk for finance purposes. But when the project was done, the gentleman who ran the division sent a note out to a very broad audience. And he's just like, thank you for doing this, because now we're able to bring our clients and get them set up to have DDA accounts on the same day because of the real-time integration. So it really helps with our client service. So it's, it's great it's a lot of effort implementing standards, but how it helps to enable our businesses can also be very rewarding.
Thank you. And last but not least, Emma?
Yeah, mine's probably a little bit of a duplicate of some of the others, all very, very valuable. But it is, I think of the strategic positioning, and that really gives you value beyond the regulatory adoption. Look at the broadest use case possible and leverage what exists. And that what is out there, and then the education and knowledge, and I think and champion that, bring your stakeholders with you on the journey, and then that feeds into the strategic positioning as well.
Fantastic. It's all about education and positioning and doing the hard work because it's worth it. So we have to wrap up now. So I want to thank Anna and LSG for sponsoring this webinar. Before we close, just a few A-Team webinars that might interest you. There is, you can sign up for the 18 webinar on November 7th on potential pitfalls of large language models and generative AI apps. Sounds interesting. November 14th, raising the bar on SaaS-based data management, lessons learned from the B2C software. And then finally, you can register for A-Team's March 14th, 2024 Data Management Summit in London. They just had one recently in New York. It was great. So that's going to be it for today. I wanted to thank Emma, Laura, Merlin, and Ari, and thank you everyone for participating in this. And if you can complete the feedback form, we're going to put that out there. So if you can just give some feedback on this webinar, if it was helpful or not. So wanted to thank the panelists. I thought it was a great session. Thank you. And thank you, A-Team.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Thank you.